Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure it is to be here in sunny Malta. And I want to share with you this afternoon the results of the work that I did in the period between Rome and Malta. And it's a pleasure to acknowledge collaboration with all my colleagues here listed, bottom four of whom I already had pre-existing collaboration. But I don't know whether any of you recall, but when I presented my talk in Rome about individualized homeopathy and its systematic review, Peter Viksveen asked me a question, well, how about the pragmatic trials? How are you getting on with those? So I was on the point of starting, and Peter became a collaboration for that process. And then a month after Congress, Suzanne Ulbrich-Zurni from Zurich asked me some very searching questions about the nature of the science underlying the systematic review, and became a collaborator. So the moral of this little story is that if you ask me a deep and meaningful scientific question, you're very likely to become my collaborator. So in terms of the background, the starting point was having already achieved a meta-analysis for the placebo-controlled trials of individualized homeopathic treatment. And our discovery through that process that the results were consistent with a small clinical treatment effect that was specifically due to those individualized medicines. I was paused to think about that, because that's a really meaningful point. That doesn't mean it's a placebo, but actually individualized medicines do something. So the analysis subsequently of non-individualized homeopathy randomized controlled trials, of which there were 54, and which is a study that appeared in systematic reviews in the last month or so in the literature, that those results were more equivocal, that we concluded that the results are not so clearly consistent with an effect of those medicines, namely those that were pre-selected based on the typical symptoms of a given disease, which is quite different from individualized homeopathy. So the current study therefore examines the other lot, those that are not controlled by placebo, and we are looking at individualized homeopathic treatment solely. Now, one of the questioners this morning asked the point about pragmatic as being whether it's a standard vocabulary, and yes, it is. And I want us to underlie this afternoon's presentation by just explaining or reminding briefly what this means. On the one hand, placebo-controlled trials aim for a high internal validity, a low risk of bias, intrinsic and high intrinsic quality. They test typically efficacy of a given intervention. They're very tightly controlled. They can be seen as it were like a laboratory experiment. Ideal conditions, controlled conditions. And such a study is called an explanatory trial. Its attitude or demeanor, if you like, is explanatory. By contrast, those that are controlled by something other than placebo aim for high external validity, which means that those results are generalizable to a further population of patients of a given type in the wider world. And they typically test comparative effectiveness of that intervention against whatever the comparator has been in that trial. And they're very deliberately, when they're done well, they're loosely controlled, accepting as many patients as possible with a given set of criteria, and are effectively in the real world of homeopathic practice. And such a study attitude is pragmatic. But as most things in science and medicine and homeopathy, things are not as straightforward as that, because there really is not really such a thing as a perfect pragmatic trial, nor a perfect explanatory trial at those two extremes. So therefore, what we refer to is the pragmatic explanatory continuum, where you have a continuous possible range from one extreme to the other. So the objectives of this particular study, therefore, were to assess each randomized controlled trial that was eligible in terms of its risk of bias, in the way that we've always done, and its position on that pragmatic explanatory continuum. And to evaluate the effectiveness of individualized homeopathic treatment by study design, because this type of study design ain't straightforward. You can either compare homeopathy with another treatment intervention or as an add-on, adjunctive homeopathy. We've had 2 examples of such studies already today, this morning. And I call them an A plus B versus B study, where A is homeopathy and B is what you're adding it on to. And to evaluate the comparative effectiveness, if possible, with meta-analysis methods of individualized homeopathic treatment for a given medical condition or category of medical conditions, as long as there's more than one randomized controlled trial with which to do so. Rachel talked about how to select from the literature and how you do it properly. Well, we did it properly, and I can't go through all the methodological details in a 15-minute presentation, but you can believe me when I say that we have 217 peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials from which to begin the process of sifting, 171 of which are placebo-controlled and 46 of which are other than placebo-controlled. You can see where the body of literature is. Of those 46, 20 have individualized homeopathic treatment. In turn, 11 only of those 20 were eligible for systematic review that we did in an objective process that I won't bore you with this afternoon, but you just have to accept for just now. But it's in the paper, which we've just submitted for publication last week. So of those 11 that were eligible, 7 compared IHT with another intervention, and 4 were add-on trials. And of those 11, we have an eclectic mix. We always have eclectic mixes in this branch of homeopathic research. Of the 11, every single one of each of them had a separate, different medical condition from the others. Each had a different main outcome measure from the others, and their endpoint varied from a week to a year. And as always is true in such review efforts, not all trials are amenable to data extraction, and 3 failed that enablement to even be included in this quantitative review. And this is novel, and Peter Viksveen and I spent the summer of 2015 working through this by email dialogue, and we came up with, because there's nothing clear, as I was talking with Katarina Gertner yesterday, we agreed that there isn't a clear set of information in the literature as to how to assess external validity. But Petra and I recognized that something called the PRECI approach, where PRECI stands for Pragmatic Explanatory Continuum Itemized Summarization, henceforth certainly called PRECI, which assesses the pragmatic or explanatory attitude on that continuum, and it derives from a group published 8 years ago. There's 10 assessment domains, and Petra and I decided that we would score those, where for 1 meant it was as explanatory as possible against a set of criteria that were published by Thorpe et al., and 5 was as pragmatic as seemed humanly possible for the given domains. And they subdivide by their looseness or rigidity with which the eligibility criteria were applied, the flexibility of the experimental intervention and that of the practitioners in engaging with the patients, and whether it was pre-prescribed, and how really individualized, in a sense, the treatment was, the intensity of the follow-up regimen and that of its main outcome measure, and how easy of application would that be in the real world or not, participant compliance and practitioner adherence to the study protocol and the prescribed intervention, respectively, and broadly speaking, where the analysis target, at the end of the day, the summary, the bottom line of the study, was relating to usual or ideal conditions. So we were experimenting with this, and we iteratively came forward with a realization, this worked. This works. And in order to operationalize, nasty English word, but it's relevant in context, this, as you can see in summary, is how we did bands of scoring that enabled us to characterize a trial from the one extreme of much more explanatory than pragmatic at one end to much more pragmatic than explanatory at the other. And we made sure we looked at boundary values of 17 and 18, for example, and looked at the whole trial to try and give us a statement that reflected that trial as regards its position on the continuum. And our findings were stark, and they are that 2 of the studies weren't pragmatic at all. 4 of them were equally pragmatic and explanatory, and only 2 were much more pragmatic than explanatory. So in actual fact, only 5/11ths of this small literature actually are clearly pragmatic studies, and that's quite sobering. And I'm not going to spend any time on this because you've heard me say this often, and those who were in the workshop yesterday afternoon heard me say it again. We have 7 domains of assessment that are precisely according to Cochrane criteria in terms of randomization, blinding, and so on. But the thing that's unique to this study and what we really connected with because we're looking at pragmatic studies is that we know, and we spoke about this with 2 years ago with Petra Clement, and Stefan this morning said exactly the same point as I did 2 years ago, that you do not expect such studies to be blinded necessarily, and therefore you have to accommodate that in some proper way. So what we did was that we reflected on studies that turned out to be pragmatic and looked at them in a slightly different, maybe softer way, because we knew that therefore they would not be participant blinded. The risk of bias assessments reflecting all of the above discovered, and again it's not untypical of our systematic reviews, that 9/11ths of the studies were actually at high risk of bias. The one coloured in dark blue there, just offset at 2 o'clock, is the one. There was one study for which non-blinding of participants and a pragmatic study design coalesced into a study that we respected as a separate category. But there's only one of those out of the 11. And the other was merely uncertain risk of bias, which in other words was the best study. And here's a summary of results. Now, I checked Michael at lunchtime when Michael Frass presented his talk this morning. The one at the bottom of the slide here is the trial that Michael presented. So I'm pleased to be able to report, Michael, that we identified through the Précis method that your study was more pragmatic than explanatory and is therefore one of the 6 of the 11 that fall into that category overall. And you can see, just summarized, I don't mean you to look at all the details, but the bottom line more especially is in this column, which just characterizes the high or uncertain risk of bias. The one whose risk of bias is mitigated by the fact that it had non-blinding of participants, yet was pragmatic, much more pragmatic than explanatory in actual fact. So you can see there the specific trials. You'll know many of those, each individual trials, just by the name of their authors there on the left-hand column. And now to the meta-analysis, where we compare in turn the individualized homeopathic treatment against, in this case, the other other intervention. And there's 4 of this category. And here we've got odds ratio, where the effects favoring homeopathy are on the right-hand side of the line of no change there, the unity. And you can see actually that none of them is positive, and one of them is negative. And then there's another singleton study that is a non-inferiority trial. It's rather like, but not quite the same as, an equivalence trial. And this is Adler's study on depression, where individualized homeopathic treatment is compared against Prozac. And the terms of reference for a non-inferiority trial is that this actually represents a significant effect, a significant equivalence between the 2 intervention modalities. Here now, just to confuse you, but not deliberately, it's a feature of statistics that cannot be avoided. Here we've got the effect favoring homeopathy is to the left, because the measure of difference between the groups is that of standardized mean difference and not odds ratio. And then the final group, which are the add-on trials, the A plus B versus B studies, and there's 3 of them. And the thing to notice that individually, one of them is positive, and the others are just bordering on the positive. And this is, again, acknowledging our chairman today, that one study that's positive is Michael's. And he showed that this morning. So reassuringly, we have a pragmatic study of Michael's. That is positive, and he said that this morning. So our study, our analysis approach reflects the original author's findings, which isn't always the case in homeopathic research reviews. But the thing I want to emphasize is this, that collectively, and it's the whole point of meta-analysis rather than look at a study separately from all the others, you collectively analyze. That's what meta-analysis does. And you can see that the mean and the 95% confidence interval for the mean effect across the 3 studies together is statistically favorable towards homeopathy. So these add-on studies are better news in terms of the findings. And just to return to this for a moment, what we also discovered with these self-same studies, that they were invariably pragmatic in character. So summarizing, the startling finding that only 5 of 11 trials were more pragmatic than explanatory, but that pragmatic approach did typically characterize trials of adjunctive add-on homeopathy. Internal validity was poor overall. Risk of bias, in other words, was high. But that there was one pragmatic trial of add-on homeopathy that had this understandable high risk of bias as regarding participant blinding. And in terms of analysis, meta-analysis by study design, we find no significant effect overall of IHT against another intervention. We do reflect the original authors in Mexico who discovered non-inferiority of IHT compared with Prozac. And we find that over just the 3 studies that were add-on type, we did find an overall statistically significant effect favoring homeopathy at the 2% level. And there was no opportunity to do meta-analysis by medical condition because we had 11 of them. So overall conclusions, therefore, we've done this comparative assessment by study design and attempted clinical condition, but there's an uncertainty in the findings, significantly because of the small overall numbers. 11 is not a great number to grapple with, but we have been able to discern facets of this connected with study design, but are in no position to say anything about by medical condition or by its category. That, in actual fact, some of what are called pragmatic studies aren't, and therefore their results are less generalizable than they were intended to be. We've confirmed that the one study, the non-inferiority study, is positive towards homeopathy. However, that particular trial, and I didn't highlight it as we went through, actually that trial is one of the explanatory ones. So its data are not generalizable, unfortunately. But with the better news to end with, and I always like to try and do that because it's about purposeful, positive looking forward to better results informed by what's been published in the past, that add-on homeopathy may be comparatively more effective, the proof is in these 3 studies collectively, than another intervention alone. But there is an issue with low quality. They are, however, more generalizable in their data because of their pragmatic study attitude, as we've identified. And I would commend those, based on just this early finding, that this may be the way to go with homeopathic research in terms of a confidence that you can achieve pragmatic attitude and have a decent chance of a positive finding that will be revealed in the context of an RCT. So we leave you with that positive and, I hope, encouraging thought. Thank you.